Thank you very much. This is a great privilege to be able to visit with you guys today. And let me just say a couple of things. First, I want you to understand, I'm glad we got a small group here, a relatively small group here. I want you to be comfortable. I want it to be like we're sitting around my living room having a cup of coffee. If you have a question, raise your hand. We'll stop the train and address it. It's a very small train, by the way. So be glad to address concerns as they come up. We're going to have, hope to have ample opportunity for Q&A after each little section that we go through. It's my goal, my overall goal here is to make sure that you take away something of value. And I've got this little dog and pony show that I'm going to go through, and but if it's not, and hopefully it will deliver some interesting, helpful information. But if it's not, and you need to go a different direction, then raise your hand and say, "Hey, this is great, but I want to know about X." As you know, the primary focus of what we're doing today is how to prepare to go to a local tax sale and successfully participate. That's kind of the scope of what we got going on here. This material does not cover how do I buy sold estate properties or how do I participate in that part of the process. Now, again, I'm happy to touch on that or go there in some of the Q&A. So that's not off limits. I'm just telling you that's the scope of what we're doing today is just to get you ready to go to a local tax sale. Now, before we get started, those of you who know me, this is not going to be a surprise, but I would like to give an invocation before we get started and just ask the Lord's blessing on our time together. Let me pray for us. Lord, we are grateful for the blessings of life and for the privilege of living in the land that we live in. We pray that your hand would be on our families today, give healing where it's needed, encouragement where it's needed, and we pray that you bless our time together, that we might communicate clearly and we might honor you in all things. In Christ's name I pray, amen. All right, we're going to get started here. And the first thing I need to tell you, and you're going to figure it out pretty soon after I talk for about 3 more seconds, I'm not an attorney, I'm not a financial advisor, and everything you hear today is going to be based on my personal opinion and based on my personal experiences. So I just have to say that before we get started. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I came to see the light of day on this little patch of dirt in Tuscaloosa County between Colding and Vance, Alabama. That's where I grew up. That's where my parents lived until this past October when they moved to a retirement facility. But they lived there for 52 years, and that's where I spent my growing up years. You all have probably heard of that little place called Vance, Alabama. Well, I was there from the Vance area before it was cool to be from Vance. And one day in 1996, this little sign popped up beside the interstate. And talk about getting an education in real estate, the dynamic of Mercedes coming to that rural area of Alabama obviously made a significant impact not only on the real estate industry but on every other industry in our state. My grandparents had a little 8-acre farm right in there, and about a third of it got gobbled up by the right-of-way for that road they put in right there. So anyway, it's amazing the disproportionate impact that something like that can have on real estate, and we'll talk about that later. In 1979, I went to, after I graduated from high school, I went to Samford University like all good Baptists do, and then in 1984, I went to work in this building and for the Jefferson County Tax Collector's Office. And that little window right there is where I spent about 20 of the 25 years that I worked for the tax collector's office. I started out in a political appointee position working for the tax collector. His name was O.Z. Hall. That was in 1984. Subsequent to him was Jack Williams, and the current tax collector is a guy named J.T. Smallwood, and I worked for all three of those administrations. For the first 5 years, as I said, I was a political appointee. I was kind of an executive assistant. For the next 20 years, I was in charge of land redemptions. Land redemptions is the little sub-department that of the tax collector's office that deals with delinquent property taxes. After property goes through a tax sale, it goes over to the land redemptions division, and that's where you go to redeem property. That's the little area that dealt with all the investors and keeping the docket books and all that sort of thing. So we had about 5 employees, and matter of fact, some of you I met while I was working for the county. It was during a time of great amplitude change in terms of the dynamics of what was happening as far as tax sales in the state. As you know, Jefferson County is the biggest state in terms of population, in terms of the revenues they bring in, and also in terms of the problems they have. So I think, of course, I'm a little prejudiced, but I think Jefferson County was kind of a microcosm of what was going on statewide, particularly in the area of tax sales. There's my moment of fame. Back in 1991, we were conducting the tax sales in the lobby of the courthouse. The state statute actually says it's supposed to be on the courthouse steps, but we always had it in the lobby there, or not always, but for several years. And then it was later moved to a courtroom, which I think is a much better situation. There's my family. As you can tell, I'm used to dealing with a crowd. And I feel very fortunate. And they're all still speaking to me as of this morning. And we'll touch on what it means to what true success is here in just a minute, like right now. Let's talk about philosophy. And let me just say this. You could probably say, and rightfully so, Gary, we really don't care about what you think about your philosophy of work, or your philosophy of family, or even your philosophy of your faith. But what that does is going to be an indicator of why I say some of the things I do about everything else we talk about today. What we believe, honestly, what we believe about God determines how we live, how we conduct business, how we conduct our family, how we conduct every aspect of life. But from a business standpoint, I want to talk about philosophy. What is true success? What does it matter if I am successful, if I make a lot of money, if I do a lot of deals, but my relationships stink? Maybe I've got a marriage that's not very good. Maybe I've got children who are not speaking to me. Maybe I've got issues that are more important than me making a lot of money that are not getting the attention that they need to get. What is true prosperity? The only perfect man ever to live said this: "For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul?" And that's exactly what I'm talking about. What are we living our lives? What priorities are we living our lives in light of? Nobody ever has said this quote that I know of as a deathbed confession: "If I just spent more time at the office, if I just spent more time doing deals, if I just spent more time trying to be productive instead of investing in things that really matter, going to matter for the long haul." 3 things that I have learned the hard way through experience, and I've learned that the single greatest commodity is what? Who's going to tell me what that is? Time is exactly right. We all have the same amount, and once it's gone, I know y'all have all heard this before. If you've gone to any kind of motivational or business type of philosophy presentation, you hear that time is the most important thing. You hear that we all have the same amount. You hear that once it's gone, you can never get it back, and all that is certainly true. But nonetheless, we need to acknowledge that obviously life is short. The older we get, the more we realize that. Second greatest commodity, who can tell me what the next thing is I'm going to say? I learned this at the last time I spoke at REI Live. How about health? That's close, very close. If we have time but we don't have health, really doesn't matter. If we have time but we don't have the energy to execute, to participate, then it really doesn't matter. So I think obviously that's a huge component in being successful. The third greatest commodity, who can tell me what they think is the third greatest commodity?
Relationships.
Well, that's a great suggestion. I was being a little more, I was thinking a little more tangible in terms of what we do, why we do what we do. Relationships are obviously important, but I may need to put that as number 3. Real estate. Well, Gary, we're speaking from a real estate, you're speaking on behalf of real estate, or as being sponsored by a real estate organization. You're involved in real estate. Everybody in this room is to some degree or another involved in real estate. Obviously, you're going to say that. Well, not exactly, but here's why I'm going to say that. Can anybody name any activity that anybody participates in that doesn't at least indirectly deal with real estate? If you get in an airplane and you fly around the world, my brother I dropped him off the airport 2 days ago. His family's a missionary in Malaysia. I checked his Find My Friends this morning. He was 10,798 miles away in Malaysia. But guess where he had to land? He had to land on real estate over there, but it's still real estate. If I live in a high-rise condo on the 84th floor, that building is still on real estate. If I live in a mobile home, if I live in a house, my point is, I think you get, everything that people do, living itself is at least indirectly related to real estate. So I would contend that real estate is the single most valuable non-human commodity available. So we better have a pretty good idea of how we're going to interact with it, especially if we're in a real estate related business. Now, as we talk about tax sales, you're going to find out real quick that my philosophy is not one of a get-rich-quick mentality. It's not one that, hey, my ship has just come in on this one item. It's not, hey, I just won the lottery. That's not me. I don't encourage anybody to go that route. Are some people going to be more successful than others? Absolutely. Are some people going to get a really good deal sometime? Absolutely. But we all can't be the founder of Apple or Microsoft. Some of us have got to work for a living. No, I'm kidding. Those guys work for a living. But my point is, by and large, the majority of us are not going to win the lottery. We're not going to have some kind of cataclysmic event that makes us wealthy, and we're going to have to work. And in my opinion, that's kind of the way God set up the system. Speaking of tax sales, I got this on my phone a couple of years ago. It popped up. Learn how to buy tax liens. Buy a home for taxes owed and get 18 to 36% interest. And you've heard the infomercials or heard of infomercials that pop up or that come up on cable television or whatever you're watching and talk about buying houses for $500 down. Let me just tell you, in my world and in your world, that does not happen. Not from just a tax sale. I don't know anybody who has done that. Now, I'm not saying it's never happened, but that's certainly not a daily event, and that obviously appeals to the idea that, hey, I can get a lot for a little bit of investment. And, as you know, we all have to if we do anything, we're going to have to be to a successful level. We're going to have to invest. We're either going to have to invest in the capital of education, the capital of cash, or the capital of time, or the capital of labor, which is time as well. So walking along the street and finding a check made out to yourself for $1 million is simply not the real world. The wisest man ever to live said this: a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor than silver and gold. I heard somebody say the other day, naked you came into the world, and naked you will go out, and naked hadn't got any pockets. So we are not taking anything with us. We're going to take out exactly what we brought in. And in the meantime, obviously, we have to have something to live on. We have to provide for our families. But it's important to have this perspective when we're involved in any kind of business. Here's the seminar in a sentence. Don't BS. Don't be stupid. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is, you could say, well, Gary, that's just common sense. And it really is. A lot of it is just plain common sense. If you stop and think about it, you say, well, yeah, that makes sense. You'd be surprised at how many people would kind of get a bug for doing something, maybe it's tax sales, and they just skip right over the common sense part, and they jump to conclusions, or they jump to the process on down the road without kind of taking care of details. So kind of our mantra here is don't be stupid. Let's be wise when we're dealing with property taxes, tax sale. All right, what are property taxes? By its very nature, nobody likes to pay property taxes. I think that's a pretty safe statement. I like to say that's why we call it tax and not ice cream, is because it's not very much fun. Two situations I want to tell you about when I worked at the tax collector's office. One day I had this lady come in, and it was shortly after the interest rate changed from 6% to 12%. I'll talk more about that later. But she came into the counter, and she was very angry with her tax bill. And she said, I can't believe that you, pointing to me, would sell my property to an investor. I can't believe you can do this to people. I can't believe that you think this is legal. I mean, just very accusatory of me personally, or I felt like she was. And then she started crying, and she was just having a come apart. And, I thought about that for a long time, and I felt sorry for her. Excuse me. And I tried to explain to her how the system worked, and she could not or would not be consoled. And I got to thinking about that, and I thought, we generally, we want to have fire protection. We want to have police protection. We want our trash picked up. We want our kids to be able to go to public school. We want to have all these benefits that property taxes and other taxes provide and fund for us, but we don't want to have any sanctions or anything bad happen to us if we don't pay the bill for it. That's just unfortunately, is kind of human nature. So I got an education that day. Shortly thereafter, a gentleman came in. He was I forget what kind of business he had. But again, it was right after the interest rate went from 6% to 12%. And he came in, and he was a little bit upset too, but he was upset for a different reason. Not a wrong reason, but a different reason. And he was upset because his quote-unquote gravy train had come to an end. He said, I'm a businessman. I'm running several small businesses here. And if I am short on cash, I just don't pay my property taxes. He said, you guys were the only place I could go and get a 6% loan, and I didn't have to qualify for. And so he said, now y'all have raised it to 12%, so it's not as good a deal anymore, so I'm going to come in and pay my taxes. You see what happened? The law changed, which made it more punitive for people not to pay their taxes. In other words, they had an incentive to pay their taxes that they didn't have before. Therefore, collections went up. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when people are incentivized, they tend to go the direction that the incentive is going. Property taxes go way back. Back during biblical times, there's a term you see in the Bible called tribute. And basically what would happen is you have a situation where you'd have two countries, and you'd have, in this case, it was Egypt, and they were stronger, more powerful than the Israelites at this time. And they said, tell you what, we don't like you guys, we don't like you Israelites, but we're not going to come in and wipe you out as long as you send us 100 talents of gold and of silver and gold every year. And if you pay us that every year, then we won't come and steal your wives and your children and kill you and take all your birthday stuff. We will leave you alone. And so by annually, systematically paying this tribute, they stayed out of trouble. Well, it's a very similar thing with property taxes. As long as you pay your taxes that come due every October 1st, bad things don't happen to you. So thankfully, it's not quite as bad as it was back in biblical times. The punishment was not, but there is still punishment. There's still an incentive to pay property taxes. So the state of Alabama attaches a lien to your property every October 1st. And when I say perpetually, I mean every year it's done. It's automatic. They don't have to do anything. It's there in a legal sense. It's there. It's done automatically. So the only way to remove that lien or attachment is to pay the tax or the tribute. So property taxes have been around for a long time. Now, the current system we have, current property tax system in the state of Alabama, is based on the 1901 Constitution. Who can tell me, when you think about the 1901 Constitution and you think about what laws are in place today, I think it's helpful to know kind of what was an influence on the people who were constructing the 1901 Constitution. What was happening in the South for the 35 years prior to 1901?
Rebuilding.
Reconstruction. That's exactly right. And apart from how you might feel about what happened during the Civil War, I think we all can agree that during that time period, it was a very difficult time for at least the economy of the South, for the people of the South to try to rebuild their businesses, their homes, and so forth. Here is a picture of a placard that I went to Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago with my family. We went to Arlington, which, as you may know, Arlington National Cemetery was the former home of the family of Robert E. Lee. And as you can see, this says Mrs. Lee, ill and behind Confederate lines, could not pay taxes on the estate, consequently was seized for unpaid taxes and purchased by the federal government at the tax sale. In May 1864, the government established a national cemetery on land surrounding the house. So, and this is kind of would be typical of a situation in the South where lots of people lost their property for various reasons, but mainly because they couldn't afford to either maintain or pay the taxes on it. So, as a result of those kinds of things that were influencing the 1901 Constitution, state statute and court rulings go to great lengths to protect the redemption rights of property owners. So, it's been my limited experience at any time I'm involved in a situation that a judge or is usually going to give the benefit of the doubt to the party that is trying to redeem property. So, that being said, let's talk about the general property tax cycle. The first thing that happens is that the Board of Equalization, or the office that provides that function, some counties it's the Revenue Commission. Let me back up. Y'all probably know this, but in some counties, you have a multi-tiered operation that handles the property tax process. In Jefferson County, you have the Board of Equalization, which establishes the value. Then you have the assessment component, which is handled by the tax assessor. And then you have the collection component, which is handled by the tax collector. That's who I worked for. Some counties over the years have decided to combine all three of those functions, and they do it in the form of a revenue commissioner or a revenue commissioner's office. And I'm sure they were trying to simplify those processes, save some money too, as far as personnel goes, and provide just a single elected person to be in charge of all three of those functions. In Jefferson County and several other counties, those functions are still separated into three. But from just addressing the three components of the process, the Board of Equalization or the Revenue Commissioner establishes values for the properties. Typically, those notices will go out in the spring of the year, and you'll have a certain period of time to appeal those values. You've probably gotten those little cards from the Board of Equalization or from your Revenue Commissioner, depending on which county you live in, and you have a certain amount of time for which you can protest or appeal those values. Who in here has seen a screen like this? Okay. All right. This is, for those of you who haven't, this is a screenshot for a parcel of property in Jefferson County. This is from the Jefferson County website. Well, what I wanted to do is, as we go through talking about how we get to a tax amount, I wanted to show you exactly where those numbers come from and what they mean in real life in terms of what they mean on a tax account or on a tax bill. This is the total value for this property in question. This amount is established by the Board of Equalization or by their function. We see that this property has a land value of $18,100, has a little utility building valued at $700, and it has another building, presumably that's the home, for $105,500, giving a total of $124,300. So the Board of Equalization is responsible for establishing that value. Now, the tax assessor is responsible for the second component of determining the tax bill. The tax assessor or revenue commissioner, depending on your county, then applies the appropriate class and exemptions, if any, to the property tax assessment. And back to our same screen that we were looking at a moment ago, but the tax assessor is going to determine things like the property class. There's property class. Just real quick, class 1 would be public utilities. Class 2 would be anything that's not owner-occupied or is not class 1. And then class 3 would be any residential property that is owner-occupied, or it can be property that is designated as historical or agricultural. Class 3 is the low, or manifests itself as the lowest tax rate or the lowest dollar amount in terms of a class that can be applied to property. The other two classes result in higher tax bills. The tax assessor or the tax assessor function is also going to determine what this exemption code is. In Jefferson County, that means that that property is occupied by the owner and that they have a regular homestead exemption. So the tax assessor is going to determine what exemptions they're entitled to. As a result of this class, this value here is going to, in the tax in the tax bill calculation, is going to reflect a 10% amount, and that's based on the Class 3, as well as these amounts are going to be Class 3, and so the entire amount is going to be considered Class 3. Let's see here. Tax collector, revenue commissioner then calculates the tax bill by multiplying the appropriate assessed value by the appropriate millage rate. Here we are back at our same screen, and here's where we see our millage rate. This is in the city of Birmingham, so it's 72.5 mils, or the factor that we're going to multiply with to determine this tax bill. Now here's just a real simple spreadsheet that shows you how we get to, or how the county gets to, this tax amount. We've got the total market value, which we see right here. We've got the Class 3 assessed value, which is 10%. So we say 10% times this amount gives us this amount. We multiply it times the Birmingham millage rate, which is right here, and we come up with a gross tax amount of this right here. We subtract out the exemptions. This is a regular homestead exemption, so I get a discount of $71.70. And then we add back the stormwater fee, and we come up with a net tax due of $839.40. Now that's a little bit different than what was actually billed. Here's why. I'm sorry. Okay, let me go back to this one. Here's why it's different. Some really smart person figured out that if we break down that millage rate, that 72.5, if we break it down across the tax agencies and have a separate millage rate for each agency, all adding up to this, because of rounding, it's going to create about 70 more cents on this particular tax bill, and so we're going to do it that way. And so if they do that 300,000 times in Jefferson County, you can tell that that's going to make up a little bit of a shortfall there. But anyway, that's why there's a slight difference between those two numbers. Does anybody have a question as to how we calculate a tax bill? Does that make sense? Okay, I don't want to. Yes, ma'am. Stormwater fee there was a mandate. There was a federal. I don't remember if it was a law that was passed or if it was an EPA directive. This was probably 20 years ago, that said counties I believe it was an EPA directive. Counties have to pay, or I don't know if it was county or state level. The state of Alabama chose to implement it at a county level, and counties have to pay. I don't even know what it's based on, but they have to pay for not surveillance, but the study of where stormwater is going, quality of water as a result of stormwater runoff. What was happening is you had these concerns for these big agricultural operations where water would run off and it would go into rivers and tributaries and it would have all these pesticides in it. We get the same thing in a downtown situation. You get this runoff from parking lots and streets, and they go down in the storm sewers, and you got all these pollutants in there. So it said, okay, counties, you got to monitor these situations. You got to keep up with what's going in your storm sewers, and also you got to pay for it. It was basically an unfunded mandate. And so the way Jefferson County chose to pay for it, different counties chose to do it different ways, but the way that Jefferson County chose to pay for it was to add it to every tax bill. I think when I was there, it was like $5. I think they've raised it. $5 for owner-occupied property and $15 for every other piece of property. but I see that in this case it's gone up to 10. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's where it came from. Good question, though. Okay, lien is placed on the property by the state of Alabama the previous October 1st. What that means, as you probably know, taxes are paid in arrears. And so when taxes come due on 10/1 of 18, the lien was actually placed on that property on 10/1/17. That's why when you do a real estate closing and you sell it right here, you prorate the amount of taxes. Buyer sells up to this, buyer pays taxes up to this point of sale, and then the seller pays taxes up to this point, and then the buyer will pick up taxes and be responsible for the taxes that are incurred from this point up until the date that the taxes are due. So it's important to realize that the lien for the 2018 taxes that came due on 10/1/18 were actually incurred back on 10/1/17. And I just said they become due October 1st. Taxes are paid typically between when they come due, October 1st, and the time of the tax sale, which is going to be typically in May. In Birmingham and Bessemer, it's going to be in May. So the taxes are going to be due from October 1st until sometime in May. So you got this period of time to pay the property taxes before it goes to tax sale. Now, the earliest tax sale this year is April 2nd. That's in Shelby County. The latest one, I believe, is June the 6th in Montgomery. So, and you got everybody else, all the counties are having tax sales in between those two dates. Tax revenues are distributed by the tax collector or the revenue commissioner to the tax receiving entities or agencies. And this part in blue right here, circled in blue, outlined in blue there, represent the funds that go to the, where the money goes to the different agencies. You see there's a state, county, school, several different school funds, there's a city, there's a forestry fee. All those names represent the funds, but behind those funds is a school board or a city or even the state. So we see all the different places that the tax money goes. And we will talk about in a few minutes how what happens if money doesn't go to, or enough money doesn't go to those entities. All right, well, does anybody have any questions about what we've talked about so far? We've talked about the general tax cycle, and we've talked about how to calculate a tax bill and the different components of that. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes, sir.
Is there an easy way to figure out what the tax bill is if you know what the value of the property is without going through all those calculations? Is there a general percentage?
Well, it's going to depend. It depends on where the property is. Each municipality is going to have its own millage rate. If it's in the city of Birmingham, it's always going to be that 0.725, 0.0725. There's not really a quick way unless you're in Mountain Brook and it's a residential property. Then it's about 1% of the value of the property each year. But other than that, you're pretty much going to have to know the value, the class, and the millage rate in order to even approximate the tax amount. Yes, ma'am.
I must have missed number 5. Somehow I don't have anything between 4, 6, and 7. That step was.
Well, let's see here. Is that it? Taxes become due October 1st? I probably just ran right over that.
That's probably it. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
This may be a dumb question.
No dumb questions.
But you said that, state of Alabama kind of give benefit to the property owner.
Yes.
So, in a tax sale, whatever, say for instance, the property owner 6 months, I got my, my money to pay my taxes. What does that do for the person who bought, I guess, the property from that tax?
At the tax, what does that do for them?
Well, from a redemption standpoint, like the owner comes back and like try to redeem the property back, but you pay, you acquired the property.
Sure.
I mean, if I'm saying that right.
Well, as you may know, there's a 3-year redemption period that starts on the day of the tax sale, where the property owner can come into the county office, county tax collector, county revenue, and can redeem the property. As long as they have a right to redeem, there is no problem with them redeeming the property. In which case, when it's redeemed, the investor is going to be reimbursed what they paid plus interest. I know there's the issue of the verification form and having to do all that, but from a simple model, that's what happens.
So you make 12% on your money.
Correct.
Better than the bank.
I agree. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how that process, even though you're a tax sale, you bought, the property.
Yes.
But the property owner say, hey, I want my property back, so I want to pay. What do I need to do to redeem my property?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out the process in between.
Yes. Well, that property owner is going to come to the tax collector's office or revenue commissioner's office. They're going to say how much I owe. They're going to say, okay, you owe $1,000. And so usually they're going to require cashier's check or cash or whatever. You're going to pay them. And then the investor is going to be notified and say, hey, this person redeemed. Some counties just send the investor a check. Some of them require that they send in documentation, and then they send them a check. So, yeah, that's pretty routine. Yeah, that's not as big a deal as it might be.
Real quick.
Yes.
You're probably going to get to it, but so at a tax sale, what kind of funds do you need to bring?
Depends on the county.
Okay.
Usually, they're going to want certified funds by a certain time. Usually, they're going to give you time to go to your bank. They're going to say you're going to be at the end of the sale. You're going to be able to get your total and go to your bank, get a cashier's check. They really like cashier's checks, as you can imagine. So